Welcome to the debate. Today is March 3rd, 2026. And, well, the Middle East is engulfed in what is now universally being called the Second Iran War. The sheer scale of what we are looking at is historic. Over the last few days, the Israeli Defense Forces launched an unprecedented campaign against Iranian leadership. We are talking about 100 aircraft dropping 250 munitions right into Tehran, hitting strategic bases and even the compound used by Supreme Leader Khamenei.
And they didn't stop at active military targets either. They struck inactive nuclear sites like Natanz, which, I should point out, hasn't even been operational since June of last year, and the aggressively targeted proxy networks deep inside Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria.
Exactly. And the response from Tehran has been just as massive. Iran announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. They've attacked United States embassies in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and they have launched 119 distinct attack waves against Israel just since February 28th. This brings us to the central question we are unpacking today. Does ripping apart Iran's proxy network and military infrastructure pave the way for a long-term, state-led structural correction in the Middle East? Or
does taking a sledgehammer to this system plunge the region into an uncontrollable security vacuum, spark a multipolar arms race, and trigger a global humanitarian crisis that the world is completely unequipped to handle?
Right. That is the crux of it. I will be taking the position that dismantling Iran's forward defense strategy, while incredibly painful, is a strictly necessary structural correction. It is the only way to allow regional powers to finally replace proxy-driven chaos with state-backed stability.
And I will be arguing that this is far from a stabilizing correction. This massive military escalation is actively destroying the prospects for diplomatic normalization. It's triggering a highly dangerous regional arms race and risking a catastrophic displacement crisis when the global resettlement framework is, frankly, already collapsing.
Let's get right into it then, because we really have to look at what stability actually means in this context. For decades, the Middle East has operated under Iran's forward defense strategy. Basically, Tehran kept conflicts far away from its own borders by funding proxy militias that deliberately eroded the sovereignty of neighboring countries. I mean, you cannot have a functioning state when a foreign-backed militia is running a parallel government. But look at the immediate measurable shifts happening right now in Lebanon. By systematically striking Hezbollah's financial network, specifically taking out 18 branches of their internal banking system, Al-Qard al-Hassan, across southern Lebanon, the IDF isn't just hitting missile launchers. They are dismantling the group's ability to pay its fighters.
And taking out key commanders like Reza Khazai in the process.
Precisely. And because that proxy structure is suddenly paralyzed, the actual Lebanese government is finally stepping into the void. The Council of Ministers in Babdek is now demanding exclusive state authority over decisions of war and peace. You have the Lebanese Minister of Communications stating on record, "We cannot have half a state." The Lebanese army is actually deploying checkpoints to the south and arresting armed Hezbollah operatives. That is what state sovereignty looks like.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. A paralyzed militia doesn't magically create a stable democracy overnight.
No, it creates a vacuum. But that vacuum is already being filled by the pragmatic economic interests of the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and Qatar just repaid Syria's World Bank debts following the collapse of the Assad regime. Look at the Tartus port in Syria. The United Arab Emirates just signed an $800 million deal to develop it. You don't make that kind of infrastructure investment if you expect the area to remain a war zone. They are buying stability. We are shifting from an ideology-driven proxy battleground to an economics-driven sphere of influence.
You're pointing to Gulf money as a stabilizing force, but looking at the history of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, their financial interventions usually fund opposing armed groups, not peaceful infrastructure.
The geopolitical calculus is shifting, though.
Is it? The assertion that economic leverage will smoothly replace proxy warfare completely ignores the historical behavior of the states stepping into this vacuum. The Levant isn't becoming a zone of peaceful economic competition. It's becoming a new, highly militarized battleground. We don't even have to look far back for evidence. Think back to April 2025. Israel bombed 3 vacant Syrian bases. Why? because Turkish forces had planned to use them to counter Kurdish insurgents. Israel accused Turkey of trying to establish a Turkish protectorate.
Well, that was a highly specific border security issue, not a broad regional war.
But it illustrates the overlapping zones of interest that will inevitably clash. And let's talk about those Gulf fault lines. The division between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which triggered the massive 2017 blockade, hasn't magically vanished. In Yemen and Sudan, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have a documented history of backing opposing factions in brutal civil wars. When you remove Iran's overarching influence in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, you don't get peace. You invite Turkey, Israel, and fracturing Gulf interests into a direct, violent competition for territory.
I don't disagree that there will be competition for influence. That's geopolitics. But you have to weigh that against the unifying threat of a highly aggressive, nuclear-capable Iran. That threat fundamentally alters the math for the Arab states. Despite all the public posturing and diplomatic condemnations we are seeing in the press, the core geopolitical alignment of the Abraham Accords, the treaties meant to normalize relations between Israel and Arab states, remains intact behind closed doors.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I have a really hard time seeing the Abraham Accords as intact right now, given the data.
Look at the physical infrastructure being targeted. Over the past 24 hours, Iranian UAVs struck fuel tanks at the commercial port of Duqm in Oman. They hit the Minhad Australian Air Force Base near Dubai. They damaged oil storage tanks at the UAE's port of Fujairah, struck the Al Udeid airbase in Qatar, and attacked the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh. Iran is directly attacking Gulf infrastructure to exact a price for American and Israeli actions. This aggressive posture by Tehran guarantees the Gulf states will stay close to the United States and Israeli security umbrellas. They recognize that their own sovereign infrastructure is on the firing line.
The idea that these attacks push the Gulf closer to Israel is fundamentally misreading the political reality on the ground. You are looking at top-down strategic alliances, but these leaders are facing explosive domestic pressure.
Domestic pressure is a factor, sure.
It's the defining factor. If we look at recent data from the Arab Barometer, support for normalization in Middle East and North African countries has absolutely plummeted. It peaked at a mere 13%. That isn't just an abstract polling number. It translates directly to immense civil unrest. We've seen mass protests in Morocco, organized by the Al-Adl wal Ihsan movement. In Jordan, public outcry over ties with Israel led to the withdrawal of their ambassador. The threat of that anger evolving into anti-government uprisings actually forced Jordan to ban the Muslim Brotherhood last May.
Which proves the state is prioritizing its own security and stability over populist movements.
But it proves the state is terrified of its own people. The region's leaders cannot ignore this unrest. That is exactly why Saudi Arabia's crown prince strongly condemned the recent strikes as blatant Israeli aggressions that violate international law. And it goes well beyond the Middle East. Spain's prime minister has explicitly prohibited the United States from using Spanish military bases for strikes on Iran. Russia has completely condemned the campaign. The region is turning away from diplomatic normalization and plunging headfirst into militarization.
But when states arm themselves, when the UAE buys missile boats, for example, they are asserting their sovereignty. That is a massive step up from allowing foreign-backed militias to operate within their borders with impunity.
If we look at recent data from RSIS, the security think tank in Singapore, they are tracking a massive shift. Regional states aren't just securitizing against Iran, they are explicitly securitizing against Israel's new posture. Turkey is actively seeking fully independent armed forces, accelerating domestic production of warplanes, tanks, and frigates. Saudi Arabia just signed a $6 billion defense agreement with Turkey that includes Altai battle tanks and potential collaboration on KAN stealth fighter jets. And you mentioned the UAE. They just signed a $2.45 billion deal with Kuwait for Falaj 3 missile boats. They are doing this because they feel profoundly insecure in this new paradigm. This isn't a correction, it's an arms race.
That militarization is a symptom of transition. When the overarching security architecture changes, states naturally hedge their bets and build up their deterrence. But let's look at the alternative. Allowing Hezbollah and Hamas to maintain their arsenals wasn't preventing an arms race. It was simply outsourcing the violence to unaccountable actors.
But you can't have a massive regional arms race and the collapse of diplomatic ties without civilians paying the ultimate price. We have to bridge this macroscopic military strategy to its demographic fallout. Have you looked at the UNHCR 2026 projections?
I have, and the numbers are undeniably sobering.
It is more than sobering. It is a portrait of a global system on the brink of total collapse. Global resettlement needs have hit 2.5 million people, yet the agreed roadmap target is only 120,000. Quotas are at their lowest since 2003. Just pause and think about that math for a second. 2.5 million people in desperate need, and the system is geared to handle 120,000. It's like trying to drain a flooded city with a garden hose.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The capacity issue is real, but how does that tie directly to the strikes on Iran?
Because if this military degradation of Iran continues, we have to look at who is currently residing within its borders. There are 5.1 million Afghans currently hosted in Iran and Pakistan. Iran alone hosts nearly 349,000 people projected to need resettlement right now in 2026. That is the highest of any country of asylum globally. Destabilizing Iran risks pushing this massive, highly vulnerable population, along with millions of others along the Southwest Asia route, directly toward Europe and into a global protection framework that has absolutely zero capacity to absorb them.
Look, the strain on the UNHCR and a tragedy of shrinking quotas is a profound failure of the international community. No one is debating that. But we have to look at the counterfactual here. What happens if we don't act? Allowing Iran to continue its proxy wars unabated would ultimately generate far more long-term displacement than this acute military correction.
How can you be sure of that when the current displacement is already breaking the system?
Because we've seen it. We have already seen the devastating humanitarian results of Iranian proxy involvement in the Syrian civil war and the Yemeni conflict. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. By ripping out the infrastructure that fuels those protracted, multi-decade conflicts, we are performing a necessary intervention to stop the bleeding. Strategic resettlement is a tool explicitly designed to relieve pressure on host nations precisely during volatile transitions like this one.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that it assumes the tool actually functions? The data shows the international community is demonstrably failing to step up. According to the 2026 projections, only 9 countries offered unallocated quotas recently. 9. We are seeing severe funding shortages, leaving displaced populations without basic registration, without food assistance, and crucially, without protection from gender-based violence. The UNHCR explicitly notes that restrictive admission criteria based on family size or nationality are leaving the most vulnerable refugees completely stranded.
I don't dispute the failure of the global community to meet that 2.5 million target. It's an abdication of responsibility. But the solution isn't to leave the engine of regional violence intact.
A structural correction at the geopolitical level is meaningless if the human foundation of the region collapses underneath it. The UNHCR report highlights a 32% surge in global resettlement needs over just the past 2 decades, driven by compounding crises in Sudan, Myanmar, the DRC, and now this. If the infrastructure of Iran is crippled and those Afghan refugees lose what little stability they have, the cascading effect on Pakistan, Turkey, and Europe will be unmanageable. We are trading proxy warfare for mass, chaotic displacement in a world that has clearly signaled it will not open its doors.
But look at the specific military actions taking place today, on March 3rd. The strikes are heavily focused on regime infrastructure. They are hitting radar arrays, surface-to-air missile launchers, the Iranian Broadcasting Authority, and proxy command centers.
Precision strikes still crash economies, and when an economy crashes, people move.
They do, but the stated objective of this campaign includes enabling Kurdish forces in northern Iraq to operate against the regime from within. This is a highly targeted effort to fracture the regime's capability to project power outward. We have to compare this against the status quo. When Hezbollah fires rockets into residential homes in Kfar Yuval, or when Iranian proxies launch ballistic missiles at civilian centers, that is the baseline we are judging this military action against. The neutralization of these networks presents a historic, albeit highly perilous, opportunity.
An opportunity for what exactly?
For true state sovereignty. If the Lebanese army can successfully push Hezbollah back and reclaim the south, and if Gulf economic integration can replace militia extortion in Syria and Iraq, we are looking at the foundational building blocks of a functional Middle East. The military actions are highly destructive, yes, but they are dismantling a system that was fundamentally unsustainable.
The precision of the strikes on radar arrays or command centers does not insulate the civilian populations from the massive economic and social shockwaves of a regional war. The conflict is severely damaging the prospects for long-term peace because it is creating a deeply entrenched security dilemma.
You don't think removing the proxies lessens that dilemma?
Not when regional powers respond to the vacuum with massive military buildups. They are preparing for the next phase of conflict over the ashes of the Levant. We are witnessing the death of diplomatic normalization, clearly evidenced by the plunging approval ratings for the Abraham Accords and the mass protests across the Arab world. And when you factor in the immense pressure being placed on that failing global refugee resettlement system, where vital life-saving unallocated quotas are practically non-existent, it points to a future defined by protracted instability and widespread human suffering, rather than a clean, state-led correction.
I think our analysis today highlights a really profound tension between macroscopic security strategies and ground-level humanitarian realities. The evidence you've presented regarding the collapsing global resettlement framework, the plunging support for diplomatic normalization, and the threat of a regional arms race provides a necessary counterbalance to the strategic military calculus. Neutralizing a threat like the axis of resistance clearly carries immense, immediate costs that the international community is currently ill-equipped to absorb.
And I certainly acknowledge the strength of your evidence regarding the immediate operational degradation of these proxy networks, the mobilization of the Lebanese armed forces, and the aggressive statements from the Council of Ministers do represent a tangible shift towards state sovereignty that we have simply not seen in decades. The financial interventions by the Gulf states in Syria also point to a changing dynamic that cannot be ignored. We are watching the entire architecture of the Middle East be rewritten in real time.
To fully grasp the scope of the Second Iran War, it is absolutely essential to examine both the cold military data of munitions and eliminated commanders alongside those displacement projections and the capacity limits of the global protection framework. There is clearly much more to explore in the unfolding data as these events continue to develop. We leave it to you, our listeners, to weigh these complex geopolitical calculations against the profound humanitarian consequences. Thank you for joining us.